Welcome to KOCT's Roundtable. My name is Alison St. John. I'm host for this important program to help you decide who should represent the 49th Congressional District. As you know, this year is a midterm election, so the president is not on the ballot. But the balance of power in Congress could change depending on your vote. Oceanside is in the 49th Congressional District, which is one of the hot races in the country. In other words, a lot of money is being spent by both Democrats and Republicans to gain control of this seat. It stretches from Orange County through Camp Pendleton to Solana Beach. To give you a little background, this district was part of the so-called Blue Wave in 2018, when Democrat Mike Levin defeated a Republican and turned what had been a Republican district for years into a Democratic one. But after recent redistricting, the voter registrations are now fairly evenly balanced, so this is a highly competitive race. I'm Alison St. John, and thanks again for watching KOCT, the voice of North County. And with us now, we have Congressman Mike Levin, who's been representing the 49th Congressional District for the last 4 years. He defeated his Republican opponent in 2018. The district had been Republican for many years, and now he's running for his third term. Congressman Levin.
Thank you, Alison. It's great to be with you.
So we don't have a lot of time. We're going to have to go through the questions fairly fast. I'm going to ask you to get to the point in each answer because we'd love to have more time with you, but we just have half an hour. So let me just ask you, first of all, you've been there for 4 years. What are the 3 issues that you've had the most success with, that you've made the most impact with? We might go into more detail later, but what are the top 3 issues, and might they change if you have another term?
Well, what I've tried to do is to work across the aisle, get things done for our community, and really deliver results for this district and for our constituents. And a lot of the work I do is based on the committees where I serve. So if I had to break it down into 3, I would start with the committees. Veterans Affairs, where I'm the vice chair, getting 18 bills signed into law from 2 different presidents. I take great pride in that as the grandson of a World War II veteran. And then with a background in environmental law and policy, getting work done on the House Natural Resources Committee and the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. And I would break it down to go into 2 different areas. One is the local environmental concerns, so getting the waste off the coast at San Onofre, taking care of our bluffs, trying to get more sand on the beach, and then the more global and national concerns around climate, doing all we can to advance electric vehicles and try to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, whether from the cars we drive, the way we build buildings, the way we grow food, the way we generate electricity, to do it all. If I had to highlight 3 things, now of course we've had a pandemic, a global pandemic, for the last couple of years, which has had profound impacts on society, and a lot of the work that I've done in the last couple of years has been focused on making sure the economy recovers, people get back to work, back to school. Proud of much of what we've been able to accomplish in that regard too.
Now, money, of course, is the life's blood of politics, so I need to ask you, who would you say are your top 3 donors?
Well, I'm proud that we have over 250,000 individuals who've contributed to our campaign since I started, average of about $50, so there are no top 3. And I'm really also proud of the fact we take no corporate PAC money. I'm one of about 40 members of the House that refuses any corporate PAC donations. But if you look at our donor list, it's all public information. I'm really proud of both individuals and organizations, folks like the League of Conservation Voters and the Sierra Club and other organizations like that, and Citizens United. So I'm very, very proud of who funds our campaigns, and I'm very frankly worried about those who are funded by big oil or big corporations, because I think at the end of the day, it's very difficult to distance yourself from a policy perspective when you're constantly taking their money, which is why I not only don't take corporate PAC money, but I've helped to introduce legislation that would ban corporate PACs altogether.
Okay, I want to jump straight into the perhaps hottest issue that is just making news at the moment, which is the Supreme Court's possible reversal of Roe versus Wade. So if Roe versus Wade is reversed, what is your position on how abortion should be regulated? Well,
first of all, I was disgusted and very, very angry at that decision, which I felt, it is of course a draft decision, but I felt it was neither legally nor constitutionally correct, and it has far-reaching implications because it tracks back to Griswold versus Connecticut and really anything dealing with privacy. So things like access to contraception or LGBTQ issues. All is at risk because of that draft opinion. So I hope there's an opportunity for the other justices to weigh in. But make no mistake, Congress needs to act. We have legislation, the Women's Health Protection Act, that I've co-sponsored, that's already passed the House of Representatives. We sent it to the Senate. It would codify Roe versus Wade. That's exactly what we need to do. And unfortunately, the filibuster stands in the way of accomplishing it in the Senate. So I implore those senators, consider the impact that this will have on women all across the United States, do the right thing, and pass the Women's Health Protection Act and get it to President Biden's desk.
But if it passes, would you say that abortion should be regulated, and what might you support?
Well, obviously, we want safe, legal, and rare abortion in the United States, and the number has actually declined in recent years. What we don't want is to go back into the dark ages where people are having to travel multiple state lines or even doing things that are illegal or worried that they're going to be arrested themselves. This is all about basic women's health access and health care, and we have to do all we can to stand up. The overwhelming majority of Americans want to see Roe versus Wade protected, and if the Supreme Court refuses to adhere to what is so overwhelmingly popular, then the Congress needs to step up.
One of the issues that I think is on everybody's mind above almost everything else at the moment is inflation. Mm-hmm. Can Congress do anything about inflation? What could you do in Congress in this coming term to help people who are being affected by that?
I think we're trying to do everything we can, knowing also that the Fed plays a key role. As on the day we're recording this, of course, Jerome Powell just made an announcement with regard to interest rates. But I think it's important to understand what needs to be done, to understand how we got here. And I call it the 3 Ps, and this pertains mostly to gasoline prices, but can also pertain to other types of inflation: pandemic, Putin, and price gouging. So with the pandemic, when you just consider gasoline prices in our district, pre-pandemic, you go back to around February of 2020, gasoline was at around $3.50 a gallon. Then when the pandemic hit, we all stayed home. Obviously, the demand went down. The price of a barrel of oil went down to $15 a barrel, and gasoline went down to $2.75 a gallon. Then, because of the miraculous vaccines, we got hundreds of millions of Americans vaccinated. People, again, wanted to travel. They got back in their cars, so demand spiked. Supply did not keep up with demand. So because of that pandemic-related imbalance between supply and demand, gasoline prices went back up to $4.75 a gallon. Then the second P, Putin invades Ukraine. Now, we only get about 3% of our crude from Russia, but because gasoline, based on fossil fuel, is a global commodity, that has a great impact on the prices here. And so it went up to $6.25 a gallon, about another $1.50.
Is there anything Congress can do about that?
Let me get to the third P, price gouging. Exxon last year, $24 billion, most profit since 2014. Record stock buybacks, record executive compensation. Chevron, $15.6 billion, most since 2014. Record executive compensation, stock buybacks. So what do? Well, number one, I think we should stop subsidizing fossil fuels. Instead, we need to be doing all we can to accelerate the transition to more renewable electricity and clean transportation, truly clean transportation. That's long term. Short term, I want to give the Federal Trade Commission more authority to go and investigate these big oil companies for price gouging. And I want us to seriously consider proposals to implement a windfall profits tax on the big oil companies. Along with that, we are working on what we called in the House the America Competes Act. It's now being called the Bipartisan Innovation Act, that would dramatically improve our microchips or semiconductor manufacturing, make us more competitive globally with China and others, because about a third of inflation, according to the Commerce Department, is related to semiconductors and microchips.
In other words, bringing manufacturing back into this country.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So in addition to all of the above, we've got to get money into the pockets of the American people today. And what I don't want to see happen, though, is I don't want us to take steps where the consumers will not benefit. For example, I worry if we were to just cut gas taxes across the board, the federal gas tax around 18 cents, what is to stop those oil companies and those refineries from just pocketing that additional profit? That's why, rather than just a rebate for the federal gas tax, which would also hurt the Highway Trust Fund, by the way, which we need for infrastructure investments, I think we have to guarantee that that money actually gets to the consumer. That's what I am all about. How can we help the average person in this district who is just trying to make ends meet. And it also leads to grocery prices as well. The price of fuel and the price of groceries are directly interrelated too, and we have to address that.
We're talking about energy, so I need to ask you what you think about California Governor Newsom's backtracking a bit on closing the nuclear power plant up in Diablo Canyon. I know you've spent a lot of time working on the closure of San Onofre, so how did you react to the idea that perhaps Diablo Canyon might be left open?
Well, I understand the reliability concerns that led the governor to make that statement. However, I have been very clear with anyone who has asked, and I've offered with many people who haven't asked, that we should not be building one more fission-based nuclear plant in the United States until and unless we have solved the nation's spent nuclear fuel challenges. Whether we keep those plants that are already operational online, I think is a decision best made at the state and local level. For example, on the East Coast and the South, there are plenty of facilities that are operating with great public support. That obviously isn't the case here in Southern California. And I know PG&E is pushing on this, but there are significant reliability concerns. And when I see the California Independent System Operator address long-term reliability, I think it's important that we transition away from fission and transition towards things like more renewables, more batteries and storage. So my great hope is that we'll be able to bring people together to some sort of consensus around what to do. Obviously, I was excited that DOE Secretary Granholm was here to look at San Onofre to understand the challenges we've got locally with spent nuclear fuel.
Well, exactly. You have spent a lot of time on the problem of what to do with the spent nuclear fuel, which is left after the plant is closed. Would you say there might be an argument for keeping another plant like Diablo Canyon open because there is more observation, there's more regulation, there's more of an eye being kept on an open plant than a closed one like San Onofre?
Well, I think we need eyes on the closed plants too, which is why I called for resident inspectors when plants are in the decommissioning phase. And the reality is that the problem is not the waste that we have here locally at San Onofre. That's really the symptom. The problem is the fact that we've got about 80 sites all across the country in 34 states that have spent nuclear fuel and nowhere to send any of it. And so from day one, I've been working on this, and I'll be working on it for a long time to come. We've made more progress in recent months than in many years. I'm very proud of that.
What progress have you made?
Well, I started out with a task force. It was right at the beginning in 2019 with the Navy Admiral, retired Navy Admiral Len Herring, and Greg Yosko, who was the former chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, chairing this community-based task force. They came up with a report of findings, recommendations, specifically 8 things that they wanted the federal government to do, and we've moved forward on all 8 of them. One is that the Department of Energy was basically at a standstill. This is under the Obama administration and under the Trump administration as it pertained to finding sites for consolidated interim storage or for a permanent repository. Again, we were at standstill. So we got $40 million, Allison, in the last couple of years in order to restart this process, a consent-based process. And I'm really encouraged by the fact that over 220 people and communities and cities and counties responded to a recent request for information from the Department of Energy to move forward with a consent-based site. So
that would mean that the fuel rods that are currently stored in San Onofre would move to one of those communities. But if I may just follow up, $40 million sounds like a lot of money, but it's actually just a drop in the bucket compared to the costs of dealing with nuclear waste. I mean, there's a $5 billion fund to decommission San Onofre. So is that really going to make much headway in incentivizing other communities to take this waste?
Well, let's be clear. This is a necessary first step to be able to evaluate different proposals from communities. But the key thing, the key news that Secretary Granholm made when she visited San Onofre with me just a few weeks ago was she stated publicly for the first time something that we'd been talking about for quite a while, which is that the federal government is ready to step up and compensate a community for taking spent nuclear fuel. So if there is a community out there who wants the economic opportunity from taking the spent nuclear fuel, both the jobs it will create as well as the ability to be compensated by the federal government, we now have a path to get there that we did not have before. That did not happen by accident. That happened because of a lot of hard work from people from both sides of the aisle. I started a bipartisan spent nuclear fuel solutions caucus with my good friend, Republican Rodney Davis from Illinois, and we've been working on this for the last year, and that led ultimately, working with Secretary Granholm, who's very pragmatic, working with our friends at the Department of Energy to this moment where we now finally have light at the end of the tunnel on this issue after a number of years of very little progress.
So there is obviously some good aspects to nuclear power in the sense that it doesn't have the carbon emissions that we are trying to reduce. What do you think that in Congress we should be doing in order to reduce carbon emissions, bearing in mind that it's going to have a big impact on the economy?
So here is the challenge. 45% of the nation's zero carbon emissions electricity is coming from nuclear today. So that makes it very daunting to say we're just going to turn all the nuclear plants off that are currently operational. What I have said, and I'll continue to say, is we need innovation. We need to be looking at small modular reactors. We need to ultimately be looking at fission, which of course, or fusion rather, which unlike fission doesn't have the waste component. So all of that innovation is really important. But in the near term, I don't think we should be building another one of these plants until and unless we have figured out this waste issue. That's the position I'll continue to hold. And when it comes to this plant specifically, San Onofre specifically, the reality is we've got 2 active earthquake faults. We've got 9 million people within 50 miles. And we've got a military base, a very important military base across the freeway at Camp Pendleton, which is why I introduced something called the Spent Fuel Prioritization Act, which says for all the nation's nuclear waste, move the waste first from those areas with the highest seismic risk, the highest population density, and the highest national security concerns. Now, as a freshman, when I first got there, I introduced it, and I went around to Republicans, and a lot of them said, well, you know, whatever, you're new here, and we're going to just move forward without supporting this effort. I came back as a sophomore now, my second term, and I introduced it with 3 Republicans right out of the gate, and my co-lead on this bill is Darrell Issa. And so that, I hope, is proof positive, Allison, that bipartisanship is alive and well.
Good. Well, that's good news, yes. So now, as an environmental attorney, obviously climate change is one of the issues that you could make an impact on as you get on more committees, I guess, in Washington.
Well, hopefully I'm making an impact on it right now. I'm on the Select Committee for Climate.
So tell me, what are you doing in Congress to affect or perhaps to slow climate change?
Well, what I've tried to focus on are things that are directly related to reducing emissions and also our water infrastructure. And the water-energy nexus is really important to me, representing a coastal district. So in the bipartisan infrastructure law, just as one example, things that we already have now gotten as the law of the land, we had something called the Desalination Development Act, $250 million for desalination. We actually got that money through the bipartisan infrastructure law. Now we have to make sure that we do all we can for resilience and diversification of our water supply. There was $1 billion, by the way, for recycling in the bipartisan infrastructure law. In addition to that, $7.5 billion for EV charging infrastructure. We want to get 500,000 EV chargers across the country so it's as easy to get an electric vehicle and get around to wherever you need to go as it is with a gasoline car.
Any sense of how much of that might come to California?
I hope a ton of it. So in my conversations with Secretary Buttigieg and also Secretary Granholm, I've made the case that as an area that already has a high per capita adoption of electric vehicles, use us as a test to have as much maximum amount of EV charging and infrastructure available, because I think it will further incentivize people to make that next purchase for an EV. We also need tax policy that's supportive as well. And when you look at what I've done on the Select Committee, what our committee has done in the last Congress, of course with a Republican administration, we put together an action plan knowing full well that the Trump administration was not going to go along with a lot of our suggestions, but nonetheless, it became a blueprint for a lot of the work that we've done, both in the bipartisan infrastructure law, along with the actions we've advocated for in reconciliation. Now, of course, we're still pushing. We're still pushing on tax policy to accelerate solar and to accelerate wind and more tax incentives for storage and things like that. We have to get either one or more Republicans on board with those concepts or the senator from West Virginia. And that goes back to what we talked about at the very beginning of our conversation, which is too many members of Congress taking too much money from big oil. And so I wish I could end that cycle tomorrow. If I could, I would. But we have to deal with the facts as they are, the world as it is, which is that we have to dramatically reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and we've got to have pragmatic and bipartisan ways to get there. It's not easy. Our work continues, and we're just getting started, but it is absolutely worth it. I look through the lens of having a 9-year-old and an 8-year-old at home knowing that this is their future.
Yeah. While we're on the subject of climate change, of course, we've got sea level rise, and a lot of the coastal cities in San Diego are seeing their sand disappearing. Do you think it's worth spending millions of dollars, much of it federal money, on replenishing sand in order to bolster up the beaches?
Absolutely, because we know that it'll do the job. 1 million cubic yards of sand that we were able to get through the bipartisan infrastructure law for Encinitas and Solana Beach, another 9 million or so through a community project grant for up in San Clemente, also very important. Here's the deal. It's not just about sand on the beach for its own sake or for recreation, but when you consider our rail corridor that goes right through my district, the low sand corridor from Los Angeles to San Diego, this is the second busiest intercity passenger rail corridor in the United States, also has great significance from a strategic point of view for our bases that use it, part of StracNet as they call it, and in addition to that, the goods that travel along the rail corridor. So every month that rail corridor isn't functioning is about $100 million in lost economic output for our region. For example, 3 weeks last year when the rail corridor was out in San Clemente, that's tens of millions of dollars. So that sand on the beach is more than just for recreation. It's to prevent bluff collapses, yes, because the waves will hit the sand rather than the bluffs, but it's also about our economy.
Right.
Now, long-term, what we need to do, in addition to sand, there are parts of the rail corridor that will need to move inland. And ultimately, I'm working with our local communities to build consensus around that. I'm not telling them what to do. I think we acknowledge the need and we let the community work on the best path forward, and then we are there with the federal support when the time is right.
Right. Yeah, that'll be a lot of money if that has to happen in Del Mar.
Yeah, it could be billions of dollars.
Could be billions. Let's move to health. We've just been going through a pandemic. Hopefully we're coming out the other side of it. But if another pandemic were to hit, what have we learned? What should we do different next time?
Well, I think for one, I would hope that we would listen to scientists and experts. And, unfortunately with the last administration, whether it was the president saying you should inject bleach or, trying to tout hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin or whatever other remedy of the day sounded good. I think just a fundamental understanding that we've got to trust science, and what a miraculous thing it was to get the mRNA vaccine. And I give the last administration great credit for that, for working on Operation Warp Speed and bringing in people from Moderna and Pfizer and elsewhere. Really extraordinary. And I'm also proud of a lot of that work that was done here in San Diego. I was actually just at UCSD at one of the first places where the blood samples from those first COVID patients were being sequenced so that Moderna was able to develop the mRNA vaccine. I think what we've also learned is you can't just fund pandemics after they've started, which is why it's so important that we get this pandemic supplemental funding across the finish line in the Congress. There's about $22 billion that was requested by the administration. The compromise that was worked out with Senator Romney and some of my Democratic colleagues in the Senate was for $10 billion. We've got to get that money across the finish line so that we can not only get the boosters we need, get the antivirals we need, Paxlovid in readily available supply for people who need it, the test to treat concept, but also so we can prepare for the next pandemic.
In the few minutes we have left, house prices, of course, are going through the roof. Is there anything that Congress and the federal government can do to help people who are really struggling with high house prices?
Well, in the reconciliation bill, unfortunately, it passed the House, we sent it to the Senate. There was a huge amount of money in there for affordable housing. I think that's something that's so needed. A lot of what I have tried to do is specifically through my work with veterans, try to improve the HUD-VASH program, the VA Supportive Housing Program, along with other housing programs for veterans. But you're absolutely right, which is why we need more project-based HUD-VASH. We need more specific projects that will help the veteran community. I'm going to do everything I can to try to work through the issue with the jurisdiction that I have, which specifically is on House Veterans Affairs. Now, writ large, of course, we do have a housing affordability crisis, and I worry a lot about the people who are really on the front lines of this community who can't afford to live in this community. The teachers, the nurses, the firefighters and police officers, and I'd like to do all I can to help them to be able to afford a house that they can actually afford in this community, because we are weaker as a society, weaker as a community, when those who are working on the front lines can't actually afford to live here.
Now, I know you've done a lot of work for veterans. We haven't talked about Ukraine, and I don't know where you stand on the issue of whether the United States should actually be doing more in intervening in that conflict.
Well, I strongly support the $33 billion request from the administration for a supplemental package for Ukraine. About 2/3 of it would be for military assistance, 1/3 would be for humanitarian assistance. It is disheartening and unbelievably shocking to see Putin go after civilians, to target buildings that are marked as children. It is not just about Ukraine. This is about global democracy, and really about democracy versus autocracy the world over. So what happens in Ukraine, and look, the Ukrainians have been unbelievable. Their strength, their courage in defending their country. You know, we were briefed, Allison, and told that Kyiv would fall within 72 hours, that Putin would just overpower the Ukrainians. That obviously has not happened. In addition to supporting Ukraine, it's about support for democracy the world over. And make no mistake, we are in this incredible inflection point right now, where democracy will either prevail, both abroad and at home, or something else will. I'm going to do all I can to stand up. Again, it goes back to that lens of our children and our grandchildren. The 9-year-old, 8-year-old my wife and I have at home, I want them to grow up in a stronger democracy, where the rule of law matters, with stronger institutions, and everything that we're doing in Ukraine speaks to that struggle.
Just time for one last question. In a scale of 1 to 10, where would you put yourself between, say, Bernie Sanders and Senator Joe Manchin?
Between Sanders and Manchin. Oh, that's interesting. I would probably say more like a 6. I thought you were going to say between far left and far right. I would say around a 4. That one of our
I'm talking about just within the Democratic Party, since you're a Democrat.
I would give myself around a 6. So I think that on many issues, whether it's environmental issues, I'm strongly progressive. I think that we absolutely must address the climate crisis with the seriousness that science demands. We've got to have solutions that are commensurate with the crisis. There are other issues where perhaps I'm more conservative than some. At the end of the day, rather than a label, I try to just be representative of the people. Ultimately, my job description and my title are both representative. And in order to represent this community, I have to represent not only those people who voted for me, but those who didn't, and those who didn't vote at all. And so that's all 720,000+ people. And I try to be mindful of that. Whenever I get on that plane, I leave my wife and kids, I go to Washington, D.C., it's for their interests.
Congressman Mike Levin, thank you so much for joining us here on KOCT.
Thank you, Allison. It's great to be with you.
I'm Allison St. John, and thanks again for watching KOCT, the voice of North County.
KOCT, the voice of North County.